great pleasure for me to be here with you today. I would like, before I start, to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're meeting on today, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and future. I have an academic background and I'm Portuguese originally, so bear with me and with my background in these journeys through Aboriginal Australia. I feel rather a great sense of responsibility as an ecologist to be co-presenting here today under the topic of reconciliation. It is, though, exciting to be doing so in the sense that natural places are cultural places, are human places, and while Western science has looked into these environments from multiple individual disciplines, from the perspective of multiple individual disciplines, really, no doubt that moving forward, we need an interdisciplinary but also multi-knowledge approach to the management and conservation and caring of these places. So on that note, I would like to introduce my co-presenters. So Glenda Kickett is a Noongar woman with family links to the Whadjuk and Balladong peoples of the Noongar nation through both mother and father's family lines. She's a social worker. She has a Master's of Arts in Indigenous Research and Development, and she's completing a PhD in social work at UWA. Gail Barrow is a Noongar woman with family links to the Korang and Wurundjeri peoples of the South Coast. She was a teacher. Her parents were teachers, and her father was the first Aboriginal teacher and school principal in Western Australia. So education and teaching really runs through the family, and it is fabulous to have Gail on the team. Emma Lichter-Mowat is a research associate at UWA presently. She did a PhD looking at Indigenous relationship with aquatic environments in the Northern Territory, and now she's looking at the same topic, which she's very passionate about around the rivers of Perth. So with that, I would like to start with the topic we've already talked about, which is, as you know, the wetlands and waterways are highly interconnected in the landscape, above and below ground, as Daniel pointed out initially, quite below and at big depth, at great depth sometimes. They are interconnected from a biophysical, but also from a cultural perspective, and from a temporal perspective, from the past, the deep time, to ancient and the present times. Despite habitat fragmentation, despite all the drainage, despite all the construction, under that sits this cultural, ecological, deep, natural layer. Shane Pickett, a much respected Noongar artist, depicts this connectedness in its ecological and cultural dimensions in many of these paintings in a beautiful way. This picture here, this water map of Perth, which you'll recognise was done by Daniel as well, you can see the same interconnectedness. So Daniel produced this by overlapping multiple biophysical layers, and you can see that same connections of waters through the landscape. You can see in darker grey areas, you can see waterways that are no longer there, that have been impacted. The shape and extent has been impacted by land use changes. And in darker grey, you can see areas where groundwater comes right to the surface or near the surface. And this map here really depicts what several of you have already talked today about, this unique feature of abundance of fresh water in the Perth area. It is a unique and outstanding feature of the landscape where we live in. And with that, I would also like to introduce our study area of the project we're going to talk about, which is the Djarlgarro Beeliar Catchment. And it goes from the confluence with the Derbarl Yerrigan here, right to the hills, to its birthplace in the Darling Ranges, and down to the plains of forested lake, the Wungong and the Neerigen Brook. Zooming into this area here, between the WA Wetlands and forested lake, if we look back just 70 years back, which really is not much time, but yet you can see the changes that have happened in the landscape. Really, 70 years ago in 1953, this landscape was a tapestry of wetlands, soaked grounds, wet grounds, interspersed with Banksy woodlands located on the higher grounds. Now, these places are important for all of us, for you and I, everyone here. And why? Because They connect us. Oh, I'm so sorry. They connect us. They connect our lives and our own life journeys. They are a source of recreation, of education, of wonder, of respite from the business of our urban living. These places are also very important for climate change and adaptation and mitigation, as essentially they are cooling agents in the landscape, also providing refuge for many species. From a Western perspective, we have, though, to admit that we have and have had a very multifaceted relationship with these environments. Historically, as Tracy mentioned earlier today, historically there were places of disposal of rubbish tips. When we realised about their recreational value, we adorned them with plant species from all over the world. And we changed them and continue to do so so that they can fit into our plans of land use. We drained them, we built over them, we changed their boundaries, we dredged their bottoms, we squashed them into suburbia. But despite all of these, recent history also shows that there can be become highly political grounds where conservation and development-related values come to collide in big backlash, social engagement and responses. So this, of course, was the narrative of Row 8, which play out right here where we are, but also a very similar social response was observed right in the beginning of the 1900s with Hyde Park. So at that time, the government was planning to put a road through Hyde Park, and society basically said, no, we don't want the road. So the path is still there, but it never became a road that cars could drive through. And so in the middle of all of these competing values attached to the wetlands and waterways, there's one voice that has been less heard, and that is the voice of the Noongar people. And tuning into that voice really was the aim of our project. When this project was informed, the project was informed by a group of people, but I guess the first person that should be acknowledged is Richard Wally, a much respected Noongar elder. Richard, his words have stayed with me and with us throughout this journey. He said, well, we've given our perspectives on urban land use planning times and times again. Where is that information? We don't have it. We need a cultural interpretation plan of the wetlands and waterways where we can bring that information, but also rewrite the narrative from our perspective, from a Noongar perspective. And those words and a few others, but that really has set a vision for what we've then did. And I guess I should mention that this project originated within the National Environmental Science Program, which has a strong support for engagement with First Nations people. And then the project took a life of its own. So NESP 1 finished last year, and we meanwhile had to gather more funding to continue the project. So with that, I'll pass on to Glenda.
Thank you. Hi, everyone, and it's good to be here this afternoon. I'm just going to talk about the importance of the waterways for Noongar people, and I know we are situated on Whadjuk Noongar land, and it's been interesting with the conversations that we've had with a lot of the elders in I guess around this research, but just the yarning that we do and hearing the stories from elders and them talking about the waterways around this area are really important, not only just for Whadjuk people, but for all Noongar people, because a lot of Noongar people travelled from different areas and different countries and came to this area that we're talking about for ceremonial reasons. And we know that there has been ceremonial sites identified around the waters, and so they're really important areas for not just Whadjuk people, but for all Noongar people. And I think the reasons around that is there's a number of things, but the waterways provided year-round wealth for our people and resources which we of course depended on, which included food, medicine, just a good way of life, I think, living around the waterways. And the diversity of seasonality of these resources shapes people's movements across the plain and beyond. So, you know, that interaction between different groups of people, different families, ceremonial reasons, following song lines, dreaming tracks. Noongar people would spend the winter months mostly in the hills and then descend on the coastal areas during Birak and Bunuroo, as the wetlands would be streaming of life and food resources, including fowls, freshwater turtles, fish, all those things. And some wetlands would dry up more quickly than others, but Noongar people were still able to access those resources and they sustained our way of life. Sometimes the drying up of the fresh water was associated with the presence of springs, where importantly camping and meeting places were. The presence of springs was also associated with women's sites. And Cristina and I had this conversation about women's sites, and it's amazing that there's so many women's sites along the river. And water is associated with birthing sites and healing places, so very important for women, for Noongar women and Noongar people. The waterways were also used as routes and landmarks that guided people in long and short journeys through the country or throughout country. The Djarlgarro Beeliar was used as a travelling route between the coastal plains and the hills, and the Neerigen Brook was also used to descend the scarp. While these traditional use of the wetlands may have changed, Noongar worldviews, spiritual beliefs and well-being were and are intimately entwined with these places and their well-being. For the Noongar, the river and the waterways are living things, and the waters and the rivers, or the Beeliar, the Kep, are associated with all things that sustain life and sustain Noongar people. Is there a quote by Mort?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Oh, so Mort, a lot of you probably know Mort Hansen, and he's been one of our elders involved in the yarning circles that we've been having. And he says, why are we wanting to pick out specific places on the waterways? All the waterways are important to Aboriginal people, not to significant spots. All the waterways, our people knew all this. These waterways run out to the ocean. That's a man's heart beating, and the tide used to come in like a man's heart beating. And I think when Mort told us that, I think he used the word Marman Court, or Marman is man and court is your heart. So it has really strong significance, you know, why the waterways are important and how they connect, you know, Aboriginal spirituality and belonging, or Noongar spirituality and belonging to places and places on the waters and women's sites. And he goes on to say, an anthropologist asked me, what do rivers and creeks mean to you? Rivers and creeks in the country, mate. Have a look at the human body. If you block one of those blood vessels up, you're buggering up everything else all over the place. Have a look at that manner. So what he's saying really is, you know, the waterways is like our blood. It's our bloodline. And I always talk about the Bakaji people, you know, on the Darling River. They call the river Barka, and in their language, Barka means blood. So it just really gives you an understanding of why the waterways and the rivers, the Beeliar, the Kep, is so important. Like you said, the waterways are like the vessels that run through our bodies that connects us all to it. We're made up of water, also made up of sand. We return to the earth, so you can see water and land are just as essential to who we are. It's an incredible philosophy behind our thinking, really. If we just try to grasp hold of this, what we say, there'd be a whole concept of change in how we relate to the land. If only they could see that. And that's Elder Liz Hayden saying that, and she was involved in our yarning circles as well. So we'll go on to the next. So this is the Noongar Water Knowledge Project that we've been involved in for about a year or so. Yeah. The project has three main components: archival research, cultural mapping, and community engagement. These components are all related and intersect to bring together a narrative of Noongar connection to the waters. And I think that's really important because it's the stories, the oral history of our people that, tell us of those connections and why the waterways are so important. From the perspective of community engagement, this project has been able to create and hold space for conversations to emerge and take place. And they've been really great conversations. They've been open and honest, and a lot of telling of stories and connections of places to family and to things that happened at those places. So everything interconnects. And we've had elders, young people. I don't call myself an elder, but people do. But so it's like people my age, I guess. But, we've all come to tell a story and to be part of the bigger story. And it's been a really great opportunity to be involved in that. The workshops became a healing place for a lot of people because they were able to tell their stories. A lot of people were part of stolen generations. And so telling their story and about what they did as children and, where they lived and camped along the waterways was actually helping them to reconnect and to reaffirm their identity and their belonging. So, that reconnection to culture and reflecting on the waterways and which have been interweaved through people's life's journeys. And it was sad too because some people were crying. So it became, very emotional, and but we appreciated that because it was a way for us all to connect anyway as Noongar people. And I think, from my perspective, I learn something new every time we get together and talk and yarn and just talk freely. And, the yarning then triggers other conversations, other stories, other people's connections, the stories that take place. They're not all happy stories because people were actually telling stories of massacre sites along the river and, that they know where things took place and where people are actually buried and also where there's been a lot of development over sites, particularly where, they know that people are buried. So it's been a little bit of truth-telling around that as well. Just go to the next page of notes. But what's really important is, I think, the voice of the elders in this project. And, we've been able to go back and talk with elders in groups and just look at things around, the naming of places in English or in Western, the Western sort of viewpoint. But then when we look at what it means in Noongar or the language, the Noongar name for that place, there's so many meanings attached to it. And it actually tells people, how they connect to that place, but also how they need to look after that place and what it means. So we've had to go back and correct a lot of the wordings in Noongar language because a lot of it has been misrepresented, in the archives and in the history. So this is an opportunity really for, I think, as Noongar people and Whadjuk Noongar people to retell our stories, the narrative, of what's happened to us and how we connect to those places from the perspective of Noongar people and to have the voices of particularly our elders in the forefront of, this project. So I think that's me.
Hi everyone, I just wanted to say it's been an absolute privilege for myself as well to be involved with this amazing team and the privilege of working on the Djarlgarro Beeliar Catchment River I grew up around, and now I'm learning to see with new eyes, I guess, as a Noongar living cultural landscape. So as well as listening to community voices, we looked for information in the archives. We sought to gather information from across these multiple institutions, state government departments, local government authorities, Perth NRM and Landcare groups who've all been very supportive and helpful. It's often difficult to, as Chris mentioned, find information that's been provided previously, and so this was part of trying to retrieve some of this information, pull it back together. It also included reviewing all past cultural heritage reports for the region from the DPLH, the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage for the region, and I'll return to talk to those later on. We're also exploring archival material from the State Library and the State Records Office. Thanks. And for example, these include, there's these beautiful old survey maps revealing waterways, often named, and they were the historical travel routes, for example, here from the Canning to the Murray Rivers. Aerial photographs, we know, document land use change and suburban development. You can see this Shelley estate there, and also an early photo of the Clontarf Orphanage in 1939 on the banks of the Canning. We also reviewed the file notes of over 100 individual Aboriginal cultural heritage site files for the region, the Canning area. And some of these contain the original hand-drawn maps, for example, by Sylvia Hallam and her colleagues, who in the early 1980s really laid the foundations for archaeological heritage work on the Swan Coastal Plain. That's an image there, a map of the Monday Swamp, Poison Gully. So this information is being collated into a community resource, and this will be shared, as Glenda described, under direction from the elders and shaped really with their guidance. Archival information, we know, is largely a product of the colonising society, and so this project then represents an opportunity to contribute to decolonising the archives in providing a space for Noongar voices to really determine the narrative.
So what has been the emerging narrative of all these archival research, but also conversations, formal conversations, informal conversations with elders? Well, sadly, the narrative is deeply intertwined with racism, with all that has been imposed on Noongar and Aboriginal people in Australia since colonisation in terms of assimilation policies and that were designed to control, regulate people's lives, movements and heritage. Sorry, I was so listening to my colleagues that I even forgot to gee, I was really listening to you all. Yes, and so this is not a topic that often intersects ecology or environmental management, okay? And I put this slide here so that you can see that this topic has actually made it recently to the journal Science, which is one of the main journals, globally in terms of reporting science and matters that matter for the progress of our societies. And this essay has pointed at the impacts of systemic racism on the patterns of people and nature in cities. So bear with me. So we, through our project and in this journey we've been going through, we realised that to understand the Noongar values associated with the wetlands and waterways of our study area, and broadly, really, we need to consider multiple layers. There's the traditional uses of the waterways with multiple archaeological and ethnographic evidence available that is proof of that unbroken ancient connection with place. Dreaming stories go even far back into creation time, into deep time. There's also that other layer that makes us feel uncomfortable to talk about and listen to, which is the layer related with, indeed, the consequences of systemic racism and assimilation policies brought upon people and families' lives that often leave impacts through generations and impact people's ability to look after country. Throughout most dramatic journeys, the waterways were often places of healing, of respite, of escape, places to reconnect with culture. And there's also another layer that we wanted to point out, which is the perspective of cultural knowledge holders and interpreters of ongoing environmental change. And I mean recent environmental change, like the one that has happened in the last 70 years due to urbanisation, but also ancient, long-term environmental change related with groundwater, with sea levels, with weather patterns, etc. So in the next slides, and so it's through the intersection of all these layers that we can really build a narrative, a contemporary perspective of Noongar cultural values associated with wetlands and waterways. And in the next few slides, I will present some of the key highlights how these different layers intersect, but on our contemporary landscape. But before I do that, I would like to point out that several of the elders we talked with, as Glenda pointed out, we talked about, with elders we talked with about our study area. Several of them were actually long-term residents in the area. Those people's lives were impacted by the stolen generation, impacted by assimilation policies that took children away from home and country. And so we need to actually put those places on the map. They become part of the maps of the patterns of our city. So Aboriginal people were moved into dozens, if not hundreds, of institutions. Gail actually showed me a print of all the institutions people were moved into in Western Australia, hundreds, I suppose. And this is really just a fraction of them. This is a fraction that related with the people we talked with, okay? And so I would just like to give you just a few examples of stories of people that could be here among us. Uncle Fred Penny, he was taken to the Wandering Mission and then given to the care of a foster family. Uncle Fred, he has an unusually positive lifelong relationship with his foster parents, which is very unusual, okay? And his connection to the Canning area comes because the family, they would do picnics along and around the Gosnells wetlands. And so the Gosnells wetlands were happy moments of childhood. Auntie Dot Beckshaw, she was taken to Corallup with her sisters. She told me yesterday, I made sure that she was happy for us to be talking about this. She was taken at 8 months. A mother was able to take her out at 4.5 years, but one of her sisters stayed there until she was 22 years old. The whole family came to Perth when Dot was a young adult, and she came here to work and live. And Swan River in particular became a really important place, again, of healing, of family, of enjoyment, and also of reconnection with culture. So Auntie Dot, watching her coming to our workshops was quite a remarkable thing and a remarkable lesson in itself, because in the first 2 workshops we could sense a lot of hesitation. She didn't want to talk, but she asked, "Can I come again?" Yes, of course you can come again. And then at the 3rd workshop, it was really remarkable to see. She somehow had found how the waterways were so important for her, despite the fact that she had been taken from family. And so she found a voice in how to say that they are important, even if I've been taken from my country, even if I can't speak for the waterways of my country, I can speak for the cultural importance of the waterways in Perth. And it was really beautiful to see how she suddenly picked up our maps and she really pointed out, even intersection and engagement with women's sites and places of healing, places of birthing places, etc. So I'm just going to go through some of the heritage that we've been, so unearthing, and it has come up in our research. Really, the research as it is at the moment is largely a product of archival research. We have a few stories here, but really our aim in next steps is to bring these and give these to the elders so that they can connect and they can make sense of these. But just a walk through the park, really. You can see this is the Canning River Bridge here, just for your orientation. Bull Creek, the Wilson area. Bannister Creek here was the target of a massive restoration project, as you may know, the Kent Street Weir. And just really a few snapshots of places. As Mort has said, the whole waterways are important, okay? So that picking of particular places is a Western construct from us to, we need to have something to hold on to, but keep in mind that the whole waterways are important. Gar Beeliar or Gar Beeliar, Bull Creek is known today. A watery place at the end of the river was a place of an unnamed elder mentioned in one of the survey reports we've read, that you could hear the springs thundering underground, and all this section of the river was very rich in springs, and so it was the reason why people were able to stay there into summer when many other wetlands and waterways had dried up. The Wilson area has had extensive evidence of human settlement throughout millennia and well into the last century. It is also the place of several institutions for children, not particularly Aboriginal children, also a lot of migrant children from the UK, as you may know some of the stories. Clontarf Boys Orphanage, the Castledale Boys Orphanage, and also Sister Skate. And so some of the camps that have become registered sites were used well into the 1930s and 40s by parents to visit their institutionalised children. Robert Isaacs became a very prominent Aboriginal Noongar politician in Aboriginal affairs, housing, local government, federal policy, state policy in housing, health. And he spent his first 17 years of his life in institutions here at Castledale and Clontarf. And it's really remarkable to see his accounts of how the river. He was not aware of his cultural background, neither of the Aboriginal boys that were there at the same time, but these boys were drawn onto the river and into the bush because of that hardwired cultural connection they have with landscape. So he knew something was different for him and for those boys that were, in those institutions. We shared an affinity for the bush and found ourselves drawn there over and over again. And some of the boys had been taken from families that had cultural practices, and you were actually able to learn how to make traps and spears. And the Yule Brook has had some. Oh, I just would like to mention here. There's a lot of heritage here. There's women's sites, birthing sites along here. An important place, Kent Street Weir. There's middens of very high archaeological value. So again, it's not because we don't put a point on the map that it's not important. We really want elders to come and talk those stories, and I've made just already a few connections here in this room today. It's for those stories to come and speak through, the archival materials that we've found. So the Yule Brook we've talked about it here in at least a couple of presentations. The whole catchment has enormous cultural value and a lot of heritage there, multiple archaeological and ethnographic evidence of human occupation, a lot of scar trees along the Canning River and at the confluence with the Yule Brook. It is the place of the Mumba Reserve or Welsh Pool Reserve, which was set by the then Premier John Forrest in 1899 as a place for the Aboriginal people of the metro area to camp. Within 4 years, that place was converted into a place for the Aboriginal people of the metro area to be moved to. And it did happen. And so, and despite being such a controversial and a traumatic place for many people, Auntie Liz Hayden has said, and this is a story she wants to tell in the scope of this project, that people were suddenly forced into these waterlogged environments year-round. They would not visit these places when they were full of water. You couldn't, but suddenly they were forced into these waterlogged environments year-round. And of course, that had impacts on health and, illness and so on. Despite this place was very important before culturally, because indeed it is connected with the Munday Swamp, which is right here, which is probably one of the most culturally significant wetlands in the Swan Coastal Plain. It is hydrologically and culturally connected. It was part of the tracks that were used to go up to Les Murdy Falls, and so there's a lot going on in this area. Auntie Glenda, when we talked with her, she said something beautiful about this place, which was, do you want to say, Glenda? You have it. Which was when she was under the care of a foster family. They used to go up there to visit for weekends, and even as a kid, I felt there was something really significant about Lesmere Falls, and I just felt it was a really important sacred area. You get those feelings, you can't explain it. There were lots of bulgur bushes, and yes, you walked up the falls, and to me, they just looked like our ancestors standing, watching over us. And I always felt it was an important place. Again, like that connection that is there, and you just come to play. Just about every person we talk with, they if they had periods of being taken from family, or that hardwired culture that was suppressed at one time but was there nevertheless, and these places really flare up that connection. Yeah. And did I want to say anything about Yule Brook? I'm not sure. I mean, one last area I would like to talk about, and we're probably running out of time, so I'm not going to extend. Another another area with a lot of heritage is the Armadale and Gosnells areas. So this is Forested Lake. This is Champion Lake. Here, the Neerigen Brook comes here. There is a lot of fresh water in this landscape, traditionally or historically, and therefore a lot of heritage. 10 minutes, okay. And so there is a lot to say here. I guess this area is located in the southeast corridor in terms of development. So as Daniel mentioned, there's things that have been on the plan since the 70s, and but a lot of the development projects that were done here in terms of the Wungong Master Plan, in terms of the Tonkin Highway extension, they unearthed nearly 100 sites of significance, okay, archaeological and ethnographic, in a space of 5 by 7 kilometres, roughly. Again, this is one area where we really want to bring the elders, because information is very fragmented, is very dictated by what development asked elders and consultants to do, and it's obviously a very important area with song lines crossing and coming through the scarp and so on. Now I'll pass on to Emma. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. So I'll just briefly share some insights gained from our work reviewing close to 200 heritage reports. These were all open access, provided out from the DPLH, and these were all submitted as part of the Aboriginal Heritage Approvals process following the introduction of the Heritage Act in 1972. So that's tracked from about 1980, so 40 years of worth of reporting on developments in this particular area. And just remember that Heritage Act emerged as a result of a rapidly evolving land rights movement, increasing pressure from mining resource extraction, and it was only 5 years after the 67 referendum. Saying that, despite the environmental and societal expectations evolving rapidly in the 50 years since, the Heritage Act changed very little. And so we know, given the recent travesty of Juukan Gorge and efforts to generate a new bill, to much criticism, unfortunately, we are all aware that there are serious issues around Aboriginal cultural heritage protection in the state. And I just want to say, I'm not an expert in the legalities of the heritage processes or its history, and we'll welcome conversations with anyone here who are. But I just wanted to point out that cultural heritage really has received more attention at the interface of mining and also in remote Aboriginal Australia compared with that of the urban environment and the waterways in an urban environment particularly. It really is a fraught space, given we've heard from Mort and other elders that all waterways are sacred to Noongar people. So how then do you reconcile this development-driven model in this context? It really requires reconciling two different worldviews and value systems, but ones that are on an inherently unequal footing. The process has been established by and on the terms of the colonising government and society. Thanks, Chris. So overall, there are some fundamental conceptual challenges in heritage recognition in this context. Aquatic places and Noongar knowledge and value systems, many of which emerged and are revealed in these reports. How do you define a site for heritage protection in this aquatic context, where connectivity, and we've talked a lot about connectivity earlier today, where it is paramount? Yes, there are many other forms of cultural heritage that are protected, such as middens, fish traps, scar trees that are discrete entities and able to be defined and bounded, But waterways aren't often concise, they're not neatly delineated, and they're even defined by their biophysical interconnectedness and their cultural interconnectedness. So this was a huge step then in heritage recognition to overcome this disconnect between applying like a site-based model to the connectivity associated with waterways. And it's still ongoing. For example, the Southern River we found has 3 separate registrations under the Act for various component parts of the waterways. For the Canning River itself, it took several attempts at delisting and over 9 years before it was recognised on the permanent register, Site 3538, as an Aboriginal cultural heritage site. Even then, this protection only covers the river and its banks. It excludes the floodplains and its margins. And it's also not easy to find out the reasons behind status changes in registration. So these issues really fails to reflect the holistic significance that is described in this cultural landscape by the elders. The process also appears to lack mechanisms to consider cumulative impact, and like the loss of wetlands, the loss of heritage sites appears also to occur by death by 1,000 cuts. And additionally, conversations with community found that heritage processes can be alienating and a hurtful process, and even divide community. So there remains a lot of mistrust in planning processes. And again, this emerged in the reporting, which documented many instances of failures in consultation processes. There was a lack of adequate information provided, for example, prior to consultation. Consultations occurred too late in the process to accommodate meaningfully recommendations given by Aboriginal consultants. There was a lack of follow-up, lack of returning information to consultants, and significantly there was a lack of attention to women's knowledge. It's no surprise our Western knowledge processes evolved out of a patriarchal academy and society. It was historically men talking to men. So there were often the male Aboriginal consultants made frequent requests for female anthropologists to be present to help record women's knowledge. There were efforts to lump or combine multiple projects into one consultation to save the proponent's time and money, but deny the consultant's proper process. And there were also instances revealing a real devaluing of Noongar knowledge. For example, knowledge of historical flooding patterns, flooding heights, ignored to the detriment of projects implementing footbridges or crossings over the river, and also willful ignorance of or ignoring recommendations to avoid going under a waterway with a pipe, for example, when it could have been put on a footbridge over the top for merely aesthetic reasons. And trying to limit going under a waterway is really critical to maintaining the integrity of that waterway, as we'll see. So I think, so the onus really has to be on getting that consultation process right and acknowledging the legacies of the differences in power in the process. Fortunately, thanks Chris, there were examples where developments have been done with meaningful consultation. For example, the Canning River Eco-Education Centre, to considerable cost, they agreed to relocate the centre back to better incorporate buffer recommendations from Noongar consultants. And the Optus Stadium Parkland also incorporates outstanding examples of Noongar cultural heritage in its interpretation public space areas. Thanks, Chris. Yep. So most importantly then, there were some really consistent patterns out of these reports spanning 40 years, the recommendations and concerns of Aboriginal consultants. And primarily they related to caring for the connectivity and the health of the waterways. And these are all things we're familiar with, particularly no damaging though to the riverbed and no obstructions to flow. And also constant reiteration and concern about buffer zones. They really emphasise the need to give the river breathing space, to acknowledge the margins and the historical flooding zones. And then intimately linked with this, not separately, but alongside each other, it was caring for the waterways and it was caring for the health and cultural aspects of people. And this was a link to maintaining public access to these waterways. And I think we can all be really grateful for all of these things, some really strong advocates through the development and planning process that these recommendations were, in the instances they were listened to, we should be very grateful. It was also about supporting Aboriginal employment opportunities through these development processes. And enhancing heritage recognition was a constant theme as well in all these new developments going in around the river, placemaking and making sure there was space for Noongar cultural heritage to be acknowledged and recognised and promoted was really critical. So just some final conclusions around these heritage reports. I guess we know the process of heritage listing and deregistering, it's not apolitical. And I guess we saw that contemporary site registrations really is quite a reactive process. You know, there's a development going in, so quick, let's go and check for the heritage values. So it's really, site registration seems to be an artefact of urban development. And there were many instances, sadly, of sites being deregistered, often for opaque reasons, and even obvious reasons where people would say they can no longer find archaeological scatters, for example, you know, as a justification for deregistering a site. And really, this is the crux of where it's just not consistent with an Aboriginal Noongar view of cultural significance of country. So in the heritage processes, then, I guess it's really helpful to try to work towards encompassing a more holistic and interconnected definitions of significance of a place or of a site. And I know the new bill is working towards recognising intangibles and a cultural landscape model, but I think particularly in the water context, there's room to grow there. And I guess the other 2 points to make is that this process can really value from drawing on diverse knowledge sources, and it should really provide opportunities for learning on country and supporting cultural knowledge sharing, really, through the process.
Here's some wise words from a wonderful man who works with Richard a lot in the danger cooling space. So the wisdom that says these ancient places full of ancient knowledge need to be recognised and valued. If you don't do that, if you stand by and watch things go down the gurgler, you are part of the problem. Witnessing it and knowing it's wrong and doing nothing, that's the problem. So, a challenge for you. I have to do this because I come from a footballing family, the Haywards, and the Noongar Nation has contributed more elite players to the AFL than any other nation, right? So that's because you learn the game, you learn the rules behind the game, and you get better at challenging when others aren't doing the right thing. We heard something of that before lunch. So we challenge you through the theme of this year's NAIDOC, because you're on the journey with us now. No escape. So this year's theme, get up. Don't just sit back and watch things happen. Stand up alongside us to make a difference. And show up when you need to. Don't just attend meetings when it's not going to be very visible, like you can hide. No, make a commitment to stand beside us to make a difference. You need to recognise that part of the constraint for your intellect is your language. English is not a kind language to appreciate another perspective. Even the way things were named. Swamp. You get a mental picture, right? Not a desirable space. But how rich is a swamp as an ecosystem? I grew up, well, at the bottom of the hill where we lived on our way to school. We just called it the swamp because we were never told another name for it. It's got a very flash name now. It's Blue Gum Lake. More desirable for real estate values, right? So even that is recognised. The concept in your mind of what is a river. You think only of a body of water that starts at headwaters, follows a stream down. The old rivers here are classic geophysical shapes. Young river, middle-aged river, old river, with the flow across the coastal plain. Classic. But that's Western thinking. And then we get asked, what's the name for that river? There is no one name for a body of water that goes so extensively. It's a precinct, and Daniel's maps showed you that, how broad it is underground. Equally as important, because that's where Wargle travelled. So recognise your Western thinking is what constrains you from being true partners to make a difference. I know many of you are passionate about caring. Do it in partnership with community, and you will achieve heaps that you will be so proud of. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to finish by thanking, as Gail put it, the partners and all the supporters, the people that provided input at multiple instances. There's 3 or 4 times or 5 times the names that I mentioned here, or the numbers that I mentioned here. But we've had really champions within several organisations that have championed for the project. I've seen the value, I've seen the team, the passion, the commitment, and have gone, an extra length to support us in kind, financially, and for all of that, for all the friends and connections we've made. I so agree with Gail. It just makes it so much more worth it. It's not our story. It's not our project. It becomes everyone's project. And for that, yeah, we're definitely very thankful. So, yeah, thanks everyone. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much, Cristina, Glenda, Gail and Emma. What a great talk. What a great keynote for this afternoon for the reconciliation. Got to kick off. Good job, guys. And when we come back in the plenary afterwards, we'll have time for questions then. So, and I've got quite a few, and I'm sure some of the audience have as well, to find out more about your project. So well done, everybody. Give another round of applause to the speakers. They've done such a fabulous job. Highlighting lots of big picture issues there.